Hello, people of the world. Distributed in time zones, sitting in your favorite nooks. My name is Nishant Shah. I'm a feminist, humanist, and a technologist. I work as a professor of aesthetics and cultures of technology with Artes University of the Arts in the Netherlands. And it is my great pleasure to invite a wonderful panel of people who are going to talk in the midst of all this chaos about anarchy. Before we begin, I just want to appreciate all the people who have made this possible and the production and the curatorial team who have worked so hard to make this safe and supportive and welcoming to all of us. Thank you very much for making this possible. It's my greatest pleasure to be hosting and facilitating this conversation today where we try and unpack the materiality, the politics, the fantasy, and the tactics that go into the movement from resistance to refusal that has become quite resonant in different parts of the world. With me are a wonderful set of people who, from their expertise, practice, and political commitment, try and make sense of what an act of refusal can mean, and more importantly, what forms does it take when thinking through the contemporary global crisis of health, environment, and governance. You will already have looked at their bios. They have all significant web presences. So I'm not going to do a very formal introduction to all of you, but quickly just to put a face to the name, we have Imani Jacqueline Brown, who's joining us remotely from New Orleans, and we see her on a screen there. Hey, Imani, good to have you. Hope you had some time for coffee. Next to me is Bassem Saad. Bassem is an artist who's working primarily in film and has spent their life in Beirut, Berlin, and New York, which makes for a nice combination of things to draw from. With us on the farther end is Xenia Chiaramonte, who is a jurist and a social legal scholar who also works with 3Bs, which is Bologna, Berkeley, and Berlin. And their work is going to draw from those contexts. And to complete the set, we have Paolo Gerbaudo, who's a senior lecturer in digital cultures and society and the director of Center for Digital Cultures at King's College in London. This is the group that is going to be talking, and it's going to be interesting. So we are going to make this very non-distractive. We are refusing the tyranny of PowerPoint. So there are no visuals, there are no slides, there are no images, there is just plain hard conversations. Each panelist has about 8 to 10 minutes to do an introductory inspiration talk, and after that, we are going to go directly into questions and trying to make sense of these 4 very diverse set of people who are going to come and chat with us. And before I do that, it is my pleasure and a privilege to perhaps establish some common grounds for why this panel was put together and how maybe we need to respond to the call for refusal. So, while I do think that the call from resistance to refusal has teeth, right? It invokes a sense of urgent action which does not merely resist, but actually ignores the institutions or authority that have been naturalized into power. I'm kind of reminded of Judith Butler's evocative plea in the early 2000s when Butler said that we need an escape velocity in our politics to get out of the gravitational pull of patriarchy. Right? We have to stop defining ourselves through what patriarchy makes us into. And we have to ignore it, so to speak, because sometimes resistance strengthens the very structures of power that we are trying to fight. So the call for refusal is not new, but it's definitely resurfacing right now, because it seems to follow these possible lines where we are trying to think about whether refusal can make us believe that another X is possible. Right? Not fixing the system as it is, but trying to reimagine. Not necessarily in a utopian sense, but definitely still reimagining a system which we might be able to live with and live in. But it is precisely in this moment of refusal is that there is a potential of escape, right? There is a need to escape the systems that we are within in order to refuse them. And I want to just dwell on that for a very brief moment. First, and perhaps it doesn't have to be spelled out for this crowd who's with us, we just need to recognize that the romanticization of refusal and the possibility of escape, especially when we are surrounded by these technological singularity moments of escaping both mortality or escaping the planet for the Elon Musks of the world, it perhaps becomes really important to remember that the capacity for refusal is a space of privilege. Right? For those of us who think about refusal as going black, going dark, refusing technology, refusing its access, refusing its presence, refusing its applications, its devices and its platforms, we need to remember that if you are able to formulate a position of refusal for yourself, it is coming from a state of extreme privilege. That the content moderator who's sitting in the Philippines and dependent upon these technologies for building their livelihood, or the gig worker who is in India, who is working in exploitative conditions but has different conditions of empowerment of social mobility, does not have the same affordance of refusal. So my first proposition, and I think this is going to come up again and again, is that we cannot reduce refusal to individual actions. If we want to think about refusal, we need to think of it collectively to make sure that the people who are not dancing in our revolution are still not left out by the brunt of what happens when you refuse the technological systems that you are within. And the second thing that I wanted to kind of bring out is also perhaps because there is a different kind of a relationship between individuals and state, right? Or the question of subjecthood and citizenship, which doesn't often come in conversations around refusal. There is this very David and Goliath story about the individual user versus big tech and how we are going to fight it out, which sometimes make us forget that the biggest technology providers are still nation states, and that they have an incredible amount of control. We hear stories about the Chinese Great Firewall. We hear about the big biometric database systems built in India. We hear about new kinds of platform economies which are coming up in Mexico and Brazil. And we need to remember that the state is still a central player within this system. And I want to at least provoke us into thinking that refusal doesn't just happen from the user to the tech. Refusal sometimes also happens from the tech back to the user. In India, in the last year, an entire state of Jammu and Kashmir, which is roughly the size of Germany, was put into a state of internet blackout for more than 300 days. That is an act of refusal and a denial. I know that all of you with me collectively face the global meltdown that has affected us last year. And I'm not talking about the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm talking about the fact that Facebook and Instagram were unavailable for 6 hours. And everybody was freaking out because they didn't know what to do about it. It might have been accidental, but it is a very clear indication of what refusal can mean when it comes from the institutions of power who are trying to invalidate the subjectivity of the people who are invoked within that, right? So I wanted to kind of just lay out these two scenarios for us to not romanticize refusal, but also then think of the micro-negotiations, the complicity, the politics of what does it mean to refuse, and that it's not a black and white system or a very clean binary. And with this, I'm going to immediately hand over to Imani, who's joining us on the screen there, because I know that she's going to take us into this direction with much more eloquence than I've been able to do. Imani, you are on.
Thank you so much, Nishant. You're incredibly eloquent. But yeah, I want to go a bit deeper. Well, you went quite deep, but through another angle of the nuances of refusal. So just about a half an hour ago, I landed from a survey flight over the Mississippi River Delta's coastal wetlands. My goal was to document the ecological violence that reverberates from all different phases of the fossil fuel production cycle, which spans from Louisiana's coastal wetlands up through numerous coastal communities, indigenous, Black, Cajun communities, past New Orleans, through New Orleans, and up to a region formerly called Plantation Country, now known as the Petrochemical Corridor and nicknamed Cancer Alley. So I was in a two-person passenger plane documenting the haphazard networks of oil and gas access canals that have been dredged since the 1930s without rhyme or reason, carving through our fragile, our emergent, our very fecund wetlands. They look like whiplashes across the entire ecological body of Louisiana's southern coast. The canals cause so many different types of ecological crises. They cause hydrological conditions like hypoxia, which is deoxygenation. They quite literally disintegrate the land. They kill the vegetation that holds sediment together as land by ushering in salt water from the Gulf of Mexico through brackish and freshwater wetlands. So since oil and gas was first discovered in the state in the 1930s, over 100 oil and gas companies have together collaboratively dredged over 10,000 miles of such oil and gas access canals in order to drill over 89,000 wells. So we can actually follow the fossil fuel production cycle, as I did from this plane, from these wetland wells up to the petrochemical corridor. There we can see over 200 of the nation's most toxic industrial facilities, which occupy the fallow footprints of formerly slave-powered sugarcane plantations. So just imagine for a moment the Mississippi River, one of the largest rivers in the world, stretching out through the bottom of the continent of North America, of just, kind of east of Mexico, the bottom part of the United States, stretching out into the Gulf of Mexico. And for about 200 miles, there's just a seamless tapestry of plantations that are now studded with oil and gas refineries, plants, storage tank farms, and so on and so forth. And these plants loom over already marginalized communities in this region that's nicknamed Cancer Alley. They are majority Black communities of descendants of the historically enslaved. And these plants, while they toxify the air of the living, they also crush the final resting places of their enslaved ancestors. And as they do so, they propel millions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, imperiling the future for the world at large. So to see this, with my own eyes is, first of all, a position of immense privilege. Most people who live in the U.S. state of Louisiana, which is the second poorest state in the United States, suffer from the reverberatory impacts of oil and gas extraction and production. We suffer from the countless hurricanes that are bombarding our state with increasing strength and frequency, the flooding events that are now spreading, just that occur now just from heavy rainstorms, even outside of hurricane season. We suffer from polluted water. Our drinking water comes from the Mississippi, toxified air. People have myriad health conditions, and our traditional economic strongholds, fishing, oyster fishing, have been broken by the ecological crises caused by this industry. And yet, because people are embedded in their lives, are struggling to make ends meet or operating on the ground, do not have access to this bird's eye vista, it's really difficult to be able to connect the things that we're experiencing on a daily basis with their root causes. Now, this is not just a result of, this is not just a matter of scale, of altitude, of perspective. It's also a result of a very concerted effort over the past several decades by the fossil fuel industry to occlude our vision, to condition us to be their acolytes, to be their supporters, to believe that there is no Louisiana without the fossil fuel industry. So I went up in this plane today in order to capture this landscape and the communities that are just on the precarious edge of rapidly eroding wetlands. We have lost over 2,000 square miles of wetlands since the 1930s, one of the fastest rates of coastal erosion in the world, so that I can share these images with the world and help to connect them with the companies who are most responsible. And of course, in order to do this, I had to go up in a plane, which of course does require fuel. And in order to get to Louisiana and capture these images, I actually had to take a transatlantic flight because I've relocated from my homeland of New Orleans to the United Kingdom. And so I've had to make these compromises, but I do believe that they are worthy compromises. And yet, 2 years ago, in 2019, I made a choice not to fly for 1 year. I had the privilege as well to refuse to travel anywhere that was not accessible by bus, by train. And I, had this privilege because I had moved to Europe, where public infrastructure is actually a thing. In the United States, there is, hardly any investment, especially in places like New Orleans, and certainly places around the world. There's hardly any investment in public infrastructure. But then again, the ability to fly at all is an immense privilege. As you said, Nishant, the ability to make this choice is a privilege. Many people don't have the opportunity to fly for a vacation, to fly even for work. People are grounded. Many people don't actually even have access to a bus. And I made this choice to not fly because I had just been feeling immense anxiety about the amount of flying that I had been doing. And wanted to take a moment to pause, not thinking that I would never fly again, but really feeling like I needed to be more intentional about what I was doing, feeling that I was living in a way that didn't reflect my ethics. And this decision was inspired in large part by a conversation that I had actually instigated in New Orleans in 2018, a festival called Fossil Free Fest. And this was, a festival that, the idea for which was first seeded 4 years prior. I had just moved back to New Orleans for the first time since Hurricane Katrina displaced me in 2005. And I saw these oil and gas corporate logos slowly creeping across the cityscape, appearing on the facades of our beloved institutions of art, culture, science, and education. So I'm going to ask you to just picture this for a moment. At the center of the New Orleans Audubon Aquarium is a 2-story tank, the centerpiece, almost the altar around which the rest of the architecture is designed. And at the center of this tank is a scaled replica of an oil rig. Circumnavigating this oil rig are endangered sharks, stingrays, and sea turtles, the various species found coated in crude oil during the Deepwater Horizon disaster now 12 years ago. So, of course, there's no mention of Deepwater Horizon in the New Orleans Audubon Aquarium, nor any mention of the deleterious effects of oil and gas extraction and production that I've outlined so far. Instead, there is signage above the tank that reads, "The Gulf of Mexico, supported by," insert the logos of Chevron, Shell, BP, and ExxonMobil. And I was told, when I returned to New Orleans and I went to the aquarium for the first time in a very long time since being a child, and I saw these logos and thought it was actually absolutely absurd. And I was told that, well, the logos and that tank, that the rig have always been there. I frequented the aquarium as a child and had never really seen them. So what had occluded my vision, I wondered. And so I initiated this festival designed to be a space where folk could actually start to have these conversations about the ethical entrapments of funding our institutions with fossil fuel philanthropy, to start questioning, how it is that we had become unable to see these signs of our occupation all around us. So you did say time, yeah? Is that what that was? Okay, great. So ultimately, the conversation was stemming around this question of whether, by accepting funding from oil and gas companies, we're essentially endorsing their activities, offering them a social license to operate. The vice president of BP has said directly that companies cannot operate sustainably without the support of society. So by accepting this funding, are we refusing our own agency? There are really essential questions here, because the organizations that are receiving this funding are not the organizations that are supporting the people who are most directly impacted by the violence of the fossil fuel industry. While Black and Brown communities across the state suffering with, are in a state of destitution, while schools are closing all around them, we in New Orleans are able to keep our institutions like the Ogden Museum of Southern Art and the Contemporary Art Center's lights on. So what does it mean when we accept this funding and do not make any efforts to, anyway, I'll stop. I see you picking up your mic. I'm concluding now. When we accept this funding and who is it actually for, who is it benefiting, and whose lives are we actually distracting attention from as we operate in the sort of side corner. Okay, sorry, this is very...
Not at all. Thank you so much. I thought there are two things I'm immediately picking up on, and I'm sure everybody is resonating with it. One is the question of intentionality, and the second is the question that agency is a very, very dirty thing. There are just so many compromises to make, and I think that's really important to take away in a world where we seem to believe that purity tests are still possible. And I think this complexity of the compromises that we make and the complicitness, is that even a word? The complicity that we have with these multiple agencies that we have to navigate with is also going to be something that Bassem picks up on from a very, very different perspective. Shall we go in straight with you, Bassem? And while you're just getting ready, I need to remind all the people who are online that we are taking questions from you. So if you're on the Telegram group, please feel free to give comments, annotations, questions, suggestions, ideas, and we'll try and pick them up as the panel moves forward. But Bassem, we are all yours.
Thank you, Nishant, for the introduction, and thank you, Imani, for a very compelling and eloquent intervention. I look forward to hearing from Paolo and Xenia. So today I will, based on our preliminary discussions, we sort of decided to open up by thinking of the limitations of refusal and its shortcomings. And I will primarily stick to my case study, which is Lebanon. I hope to give as much context to make it legible to the audience who is not in any way related to the region. So in this sense, I thought, I am preparing like kind of a handful of notes. They're not necessarily unified towards a thesis. But yeah, I mean, thinking of Beirut and Lebanon in general as nodes in a global structure of racial capitalism, which is the theoretical framework that it seems to, has been picked up by plenty others in the symposium. I wanted to start from a point of debate that arose during the uprising, which was in a lot of the group discussions that were being had primarily among Lebanese protesters in the Lebanese uprising. After the street demonstrations began to bear their limitations, one of the points that was being discussed was civil disobedience, and primarily starting from a boycott of paying taxes and fees for infrastructure services. So this was kind of a tactic that some activists were beginning to think with. And while on the surface, this appears to make sense in the Lebanese situation, given that the tertiary sector, which is largely composed of real estate, tourism, service, and healthcare economies, is the dominant sector in the economic production of the country. Most workers are employed in smaller sized firms, and a great number of unions, or most of the unions have been, worker unions, have been co-opted by sectarian maneuvering. And so it kind of makes sense that the activism can happen on the level of consumption in a way. And while I think that proves inefficient, because compared to other countries in the region, Lebanon lags in terms of generating revenue from income-based taxes, and most of a big portion of the revenues of the state comes from value-added taxes, which are consumer-based taxes. In addition, many public infrastructures are in perennial deficit, such as the electricity sector. This has been the reality since the Civil War, with many middle classes relying on, with many of the middle class citizens relying on private-run generators operated at the level of the neighborhood. And while this may seem like a failure of the state, it is a form of de facto privatization. So a lot of the energy production is handed over to small-scale private generators. And there are analogies to the failure of the electricity sector and the waste management sector. The waste crisis in 2015 was kind of the precursor to the 2019 uprising, and it generated what came to be known as the waste revolts after the state had to close down several of the landfills and couldn't dispose of the waste properly. So in a sense, this kind of total absence of welfare and basic infrastructure provision complicates our idea of refusal and has more recently been described as organized abandonment by the geographer and prison abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore. The social ills of said abandonment, such as mass employment, vagrancy, street violence, are then remedied with more policing or imprisonment or repression. But so, in a way, I would go back to the Lebanese uprising of 2019. An effort at historicizing the uprising in Lebanon that does not fall prey to nationalist retelling must factor in that the protests that took place in the Palestinian camps in the summer of 2019, prior to the outbreak of the Lebanese uprising. The Palestinian protests in the camps were spurred by the introduction of a new labor law that attempted to produce barriers to entry for Syrian refugees who have been in Lebanon since the Syrian war. So it's an attempt to drive the refugees to return to their country if they cannot find labor. However, the new labor laws were also indiscriminately applied to the Palestinians who have been in Lebanon for several generations, ever since they were driven out of Palestine. And so this spurred a lot of the this was the spark of the Palestinian protests in the summer of 2019. And between the Syrian refugees, the Palestinian refugees who labor through informal setups, and the African and Asian workers who operate under the kafala system, migrant labor makes up around 50% of the Lebanese working classes. And the kafala and sponsorship system for migrant work excludes foreign workers from the protections of the international labor law and ties their legal status to that of their Lebanese employers. Often a lot of Lebanese employers take away the passports of the workers. A big portion of the workers employed under the sponsorship or the kafala system are domestic workers, mainly women from Asian and African countries, meaning that oversight and monitoring of labor conditions is almost impossible. And since the start of the economic collapse and with the onset of the pandemic, mass layoffs of domestic workers have occurred, with many workers staging sit-ins and camping in front of their respective embassies. Just last week, there was a sit-in in front of the Kenyan embassy. Because the workers find themselves expelled from the labor system and with no funds allowing them to travel back home. They ask for repatriation often. But often that is not the desired path. Often a lot of workers do not want to be repatriated or want to just continue earning a living in Lebanon. Now, before the collapse, even middle-income and lower-middle-income households maintained domestic workers. After the collapse, it is difficult to think of what path the kafala system will take in Lebanon, given that a lot of the household, like the purchasing power of the population has plummeted, and now it approaches the purchasing power of the countries that export workers. So in a way, there's no longer this major discrepancy in currency which allows middle-income households to pay for the worker. And I would like to note that thinking of the kafala system within the framework of racial capitalism is already being carried out by many thinkers and academics. I want to note here the work of Sumaya Kasamalli, whose work is very rigorous and well-informed on the situation. And yeah, so in a way, the refugees and migrant workers that I mentioned above in Lebanon live in the country for at least several years, often decades, if not entire lifetimes, such as in the case of the Palestinian refugees. So the model of the permanent temporary worker is rampant. And I think it kind of it places a serious pressure on the approach that anti-capitalist groups or labor organizing groups have to deal with in terms of national and the non-national divide. I think, Paolo, you're also going to touch on that in your intervention. If any form of labor justice is to be delivered, the idea of a national worker kind of becomes more difficult or more untenable. kind of any labor effort that aims to provide labor justice must think through and beyond and think more deeply about the barriers preventing solidarity between national, racially majoritarian groups and non-national, racially minoritarian groups. And I think this is kind of a note that applies to many other different contexts, whether they're countries that have racialized national populations or whether they are countries that import a lot of labor with non-national statuses and then subject the non-nationals to greater abuse. But yeah, I feel like maybe we can, hopefully that opens up some alleyways for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bassem. I think there is also a very interesting connection now rising because I think both Imani and you are also hitting at something that keeps on coming up, which is who has the privilege for protest and in whose name, right? Like it immediately leads me to think about how in India we have about, let's say, 18% internet penetration in the country. So when there is a digital protest about digital rights, it's 18% of the population speaking on the behalf of those who are still disconnected and figuring out what happens there. And I think similar things are happening then with migrant laborers who are not even considered as legitimate citizens or right holders, and then in their name different statements are made. Or in the case, as Imani was describing, these people whose lives are literally being eroded, and they do not even have the capacity to look at what is happening or be able to voice the kind of experience that comes in order to stage refusal. And I think that particular moment of lack of materiality is fascinating. I'll remind people that this is a good time for you to please join us and help co-create this conversation. So do send in your questions while the inspiration statements are still live and fresh in your mind, and we'll pick it up later. But I'm going to go straight to Xenia because I think you are in some ways going to help us also think about the capacity of fiction and fictionalizing these concepts and how they are then used in order to create the rhetoric and politics of refusal. So please take us through.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, right. Thank you very much for your previous presentation. I guess that my presentation is gonna touch on the idea of nature and the ecological discourse can be interconnected to what Imani presented about extractivism. Let's use this word, but it's gonna touch also on what Bassem dealt with. So basically, I want to address the idea of nature and why I would propose us to refuse a certain idea of nature and try to develop a kind of post-naturalist ecological approach. So I want to address the idea of nature we have, this kind of feeling of this supposedly primary nature of nature, the feeling that in order to feel one with the natural world, we need to go back to something like an oceanic feeling that is supposed to be already there, that everyone would just need to find it in herself upon a more profound look. In other words, I want to address the very foundation of current ecological discourse and its theological sources, for which nature is a substance that could be isolated. The discourse on nature is full of identities, crystallization of entities that are sharply separated from one another. So we imagine a natural world without subject and a human world without object. The first major separation that the discourse on nature implies is inevitably with respect to the human. Nature would be what human is not, even if at the same time the very idea upon which ecological ethics lies consists in saying that we must come back to nature and be part of it. And the ruins we live in would be the result of such a disjunction. As soon as human beings appeared on the scene, they transformed it. And there is no way in which human beings can live in this world without changing it. Just as there is no landscape that has not been informed and transformed by human and non-human actors. So nature in itself is seen as pure, an entity that must not be contaminated. Why? What source this vision has? It seems to me to be a sort of creationist perspective, for which nature must be left as it was created originally. We hold the idea that things as we see them today are the result of a primordial creative act, and that it is therefore right to leave them as they would appear in nature. Before the theory of evolution, species were thought to be immutable, and the relationship between them was explained through the creationist hypothesis. There is the conception according to which there was a common divine creator for all things. Order and utility are concepts that derive from it. The world would correspond to an ordered set of ecosystems, each assigned to its own house, which must be protected in order to keep their utility intact. Let's take an example, and like precisely the example of the forest, which is at the center of ecological thought today. The forest is still represented as a virgin place. The Białowieża forest in Poland, on which a process of raw material extraction is already underway, is sold to tourists from all over the world as the last virgin forest in Europe. The rhetoric about Amazonia, the world's well-known green lung, is even more far-fetched. As Paolo Tavares writes, figurations of the pristine wilderness, the green desert, and many other images of dehumanized nature employed to describe the forest constituted other means by which the politics of erasure was perpetrated, displacing indigenous peoples and eliminating their histories in language, as to veil the badly violence of evictions, massacres, and land grabs on the ground. This colonial imaginary had its complement and legitimation in scientific models that considered Amazonia to be the primeval environment that changed little since the Pleistocene and over which native peoples exerted no meaningful impact. One of the central arguments supporting this view was the apparent lack of evidence that indigenous societies had domesticated and transformed their environments in any meaningful way, which was most clearly expressed by the conspicuous absence of archaeological complexes in the forest landscape. The lack of human design conformed to the pristine nature of the forest, inasmuch as the forest represented a negative image against which the concepts of both design and the human could be defined. As we see, the uncontaminated Eden is then not only a romantic vision, a naive approach, all in all forgivable, but a real trace of abuse, an archaeology of violence. Appeals to a primal nature to be preserved, especially in colonial contexts, where indigenous people have themselves been assimilated into nature and thus into the non-human, reveal the racism inherent in this traditional and nationalist idea of nature. Once we see this genealogy, we can perhaps start treating nature as part of a discourse rather than a self-evident truth. Employing such a view, rather than maintaining a naturalist naivety, allows us to see what a discourse on nature has been able to emerge from, what it has been useful for, what it is allied to, and how we can overcome it. Aboriginal, colonized people were called nature. Women are still associated with nature as they reproduce the species and still received the injunction to give birth naturally. Today, the unconscious use of the word nature, the seemingly innocuous reference to it, produces a number of problems. Taking something for granted when it is not leads to a series of ethical and political problems, to short circuits between practices and theories that refer to forms of conservatism otherwise denied by ecological movements themselves. So, to conclude, the order of ecological discourse, widespread among scholars and activists alike, still seems to look at nature as a form of law, as a norm. nature would dictate something that has the features of a norm. It would then be up to the human being to intercept, decipher, translate, and interpret this law of nature. Nature is still seen as the other that demands something. What does nature demand? What would nature tell us if it had a language? What would it oblige us to do? My point is that this order of discourse ends up being counterproductive. It refuses to acknowledge that we are now faced with an extremely more complex issues. It is not a question of protecting a nature with a peaceful face and the form of a national park, but of building spaces of survival and cooperation, of finding a way to live in the time of catastrophes and to rethink justice as environmental. So, looking at things from this perspective, one could discover that a place for ethics and politics, as well as law, still exists, and indeed can only be redesigned. And it is precisely that approach that makes nature something untouchable that opens the door to defeatism. So the question does not make sense to be posed in terms of what nature, of what this nature, hypothetically radically different from the human, would require or oblige us to do or not to do. The post-naturalist question could rather be formulated in these terms. What kind of coexistence do we want to build? Thank you.
Thank you, Xenia. That was a very powerful statement, and I think it's really fascinating that technically we're supposed to talk about technology and we are not. And I think that's actually interesting because when I think about the nature culture debates or the nature technology debates, the one thing that you are pushing us to do is not fall into the trap of taking the narrative, which puts one as a given, right? Because the same kind of arguments that you are putting around nature, there are also around technology. So I was very kind of amused that you are literally asking us to unbox nature now, because there's a lot of call to unbox technology. But sometimes in order to talk about technology, we then essentialize nature in some other format. All right. And I think having said that, we are in fact now going to start talking about digital technologies, and we are going to hand over to Paolo. And in the meantime, again, a last reminder that this is the last input for the session. If there are questions, comments, memes, pictures, whatever else you want to share on Telegram, this is the time to do it, and we'll come back to that later. But in the meantime, Paolo, we are with you to wrap us up.
Thanks very much, Nishant. I think that refusal as a logic of rejection, as a logic of non-compliance, non-acceptance, as a negative politics is ubiquitous in our society. You really find it everywhere, whether you go to an anti-vax protest, whether you look at the result of elections with populist movements rising, but also in more progressive causes, environmental movements refusing the current course of events, refusing the destruction of the environment. And it raises all sorts of questions for politics, for strategy. It is, to me, first and foremost, the reflection of an opposition to a system that demands people to integrate and to accept the rules of the game in ever more pervasive ways in all spheres of our life, with social media having been a major engine of this progressive integration of individuals in economic processes and in processes of profit extraction. It's also a result of globalization, the pervasiveness of globalization, and how globalization has made many people feel that they have no control. And to me, very much refusal is the type of politics that emerges when people feel they have no control. It is a politics that becomes very prominent at times of revenge of the real, as Benjamin Bratton put it in his book, namely a time where the negativity of the world, in a way, the question of evil, the question of death, surfaces once again, and we cannot live anymore just with the subjectivism and the politics of desire and will that we were long used to, but we are faced with the politics of grievance, with the existence of problems that affect us objectively, regardless of what you think about those problems, regardless of your interpretation. And it's also a politics that is very prevalent in populism, which is very much a refusal of neoliberalism and of globalization, is very much a great recoil, as I put it in the title of my last book, which on the one hand raises questions that are well motivated in terms of denunciation of the system of neoliberalism and globalization. On the other hand, though, always risks just being a kind of nihilist phase, namely just a phase of opposition and destruction, but without the capacity of building something in its stead. I mean, to me, a very revealing moment of this politics of refusal was in February 2009, when I was a reporter for an Italian newspaper. I went to the northeast of England in a very run-down town called Grimsby, which used to be a fishing town. And I went there because there was a protest of local workers against Italian workers. So I was going there as an Italian reporter to report on that. The protest used the slogan, "British jobs for British workers," right? So, I mean, the frame and the expectation was that this was very much a kind of racist protest, yet another chapter in a kind of rising racism and a rising conservative turn of the working class that had already back then been a major object of debate. Yet when I went there, I also understood that there was another element of refusal. Our refusal to understand the motivations for refusal, and especially the motivations for refusal of certain sections of the working class. So when I went there, I was expecting people spouting racist slogans. In fact, that was not the case. There were workers who explained to me that what they were protesting against was the fact that the workers coming from Italy came under the so-called Posted Workers Directive, which means that workers can be sent from one country to another, abiding by the rule and wages and working conditions of the first country. It's EU regulation that has only recently been reformed, though not enough to avoid this kind of forms of exploitation. So what they were protesting against was not against foreigners as such, but against a practice which they saw as worsening and diminishing their existing conditions, because they felt it impacted on their salaries, it impacted on their national contract, and their posture was very much, in a way, defensive and negative, one could say. And in fact, probably neoliberals would have denounced them as people stuck in the past in an anachronistic defense of the status quo against modernization. But in fact, it is only obvious for people who are facing phenomena and ills, grievances that are going to worsen their condition, that their first reaction will be one of closure and defense, to defend what they already have. Much of this politics of refusal is seen online, on social media. Social media have become a big commenting chamber, really. It's not where the information is produced, nor where the opinion is produced, is where comments are produced. It's a place where people constantly mobilize to say what they think of what famous people have said, and most frequent occasion and way they mobilize is by saying no, by refusing what other people have said, by stating that they don't like what other people have said. Pierre Rosanvallon, a French political theorist, calls this counter-democracy. He says that it is, in a way, a permanent element of politics that is only being reinforced in the present phase of distrust and disconnection, when people don't feel they can participate, when people don't feel they have control, when people don't feel they have a voice, the only option for them is refusal and exit. Much like in Grimsby, the town in England where the protest I described before took place, where 70% of people voted for Brexit, probably because they thought that the only way they could be heard was not by saying in the positive, in an affirmative way, what was a better world or a better arrangement they were wishing for, but by expressing the refusal of changes that they thought were worsening their conditions.
Thank you very much. I don't know if we are allowed to applaud, but can I please have the audience applauding for these wonderful inputs? Thank you so much. And also, thank you for making my life so much easier, because everybody stuck to time like to the dot. So thank you. That helps because that opens up space for conversations for all of us. I also just want to bring this this last input down, because so in my last book called Really Fake, which was co-authored with Alexandra Juhas and Chanel Langlois, we were looking at why people believe things which are obviously fake. Right? And one of the reasons why they do it is, I think, precisely what you are bringing home, is because they don't have any other register of expression. They don't know how else to be heard. And that refusal is often a provocation. Right? It's a provocation to say, prove me wrong. I know that this is untrue, but I need to be able to have a conversation around it. So thank you for bringing that in as well. Now, I'm looking around to see if there are any questions from the live stream. I have an iPad in front of me, but I don't see anything on it. We can still have some time for people to kind of process all the different inputs which have come in. But I was very sure that you will all be dazzled into silence by the brilliance of the panel. So we had a plan B where we wanted to start talking amongst ourselves. So I'm going to invite the panelists to start kind of a slow process of processing each other's inputs, thinking of some of the questions, and hopefully there will be people stuck to their screens, binge watching this show, and still willing to join. But Imani, we've been seeing you on screen and not here, but I'm wondering if you already have some observations or comments or a question that you want to pose to one of us, just to kickstart the conversation further about what does it mean to refuse.
Well, as we discussed, I do have a question for Bashar about whether there are possibilities of new relations forming between the migrant domestic workers in Lebanon and their employers, who are now reduced to a new economic strata. Like what happens then, essentially, is my question.
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I'm not sure I can answer it in the positive. I feel like what has happened so far is that certain households who had the capacity to host migrant worker, and when I say capacity, I don't at all mean to say that they had a capacity to host the laborer at adequate work conditions in any way. Like, these are abhorrent working conditions, but they, at least on paper, had the ability to pay the worker in fresh currency, which is like in dollar, like in any currency that is that hasn't depreciated with the collapse, or its value hasn't depreciated. But I think what has happened so far is mainly that a lot of the households have just laid off the workers, and a lot, as I said, like there were countless sit-ins and encampments outside of embassies, like outside of the Kenyan embassy, outside of the Ethiopian embassy. So it's hard to say if there is potentially any kind of collaboration between the household itself and the worker, or at least like members of the classes who would have a worker. It's kind of hard to think of any direct form of solidarity, but in the last few years there have been several groups, and there's been a move towards groups that are run by migrant laborers. So rather than traditionally you had a lot of NGOs that work towards anti-racism, and you had also, we had the Migrant Community Center and the anti-racism movement, which is generally politically quite sound, but ultimately it is not run by migrant workers, and so cannot bargain and negotiate on behalf of workers in a way that is fully adequate, I would say. There's been new groups that at least attempt to provide horizontal forms of welfare, such as Xenia, the Ethiopian, the feminist Ethiopian migrant worker collective. So you can say there are a lot of groups such as that doing really incredible work. It remains to be seen what sort of collaboration or what sort of like meeting point we could find between groups that identify as representative of national workers and non-national workers. I think that's a more difficult question, but thank you for asking that.
Yeah, and I think the question of relationality is something that is running across this idea of refusal as well, because there is so much fragility in saying I choose not to, right? And then what happens after that? So there is so much kind of also this almost a social media Instagram moment of refusal, which has always been there, for example, in queer cultures, right? So I remember very fondly the work of Liu Rongpong and Ding Naifei, who both study queer cultures in Hong Kong and Taiwan, who talked about how this Western aesthetic of I'm here, I'm queer, deal with it, like this is my spectacle, is not something that works for the rest of the world. Our friend Martin, who's one of their collaborators, had this wonderful phrase where she said, yeah, maybe we don't have to come out, which is a state of refusal, but sometimes we can just let in, which is a state of invitation, right? It's an invitation for a dialogue and a conversation and establishing a relationality, which might be useful. Basham, did you want to jump in and put forward a question to some other panelist? Because I saw you making copious notes while people were talking.
I mean, we had kind of planned, I thought I would address a question to Xenia, but I feel like it can also apply to Paolo. I feel like, Xenia, you discussed quite a bit, and I find political theology really interesting. So I was really fascinated when you discussed at the oceanic feeling, at a level of theology. I kind of would be really appreciative if you can kind of give an example of how, like, that kind of higher level of abstraction, like let's say at the level of theology, how that manifests in like a very like direct intervention that you think espouses the more adequate worldview or has like a more correct way of thinking of nature. Like, is there a kind of example that comes to mind of something that you would commend in a way?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Actually, it connects, I think, also with the speech that Paolo gave, because somehow what I want to address, it's a kind of refusal that it involves also another step, which is a step towards an affirmative politics. And in what I said I tried to kind of show how much a kind of theological approach can be conservative, but we don't even know that it is, and we don't even know that there are theological roots in what the ecological discourse is raising these days. So one example could be that of the house. So ecology is literally, etymologically, the science of the house or the household, right? Oikos. And this implies two things. Well, in fact, there is a connection between the very etymology of ecology and economics. And the word that they share is the house. And ecology took from these two disciplines two kind of approaches. One is the approach related to what the house is: creation, God, all living beings coming from the same patriarch, let's say. And on the other side, from economics, the utility. We want to save the planet. We want to save this specific species because it is needed for something else, because it is useful to do something else. And I guess then, as a general picture, this ecological discourse says we must make species coming back to their household. And I guess all the problems that this raises are problems that are of false consciousness. We are saying what, as humans, we are saying what nature would say or what would oblige us to do. But we are like part of the pictures and not part of the pictures. We are, you see? And so I guess this theoretical approach can be used also in technology, because at the end of the day, what I'm saying is like any sort of environmental ethics is also a technological ethics. Because if the world is not uncontaminated, then it's a world in which nature and culture are together, and techniques and technology and nature are interconnected. And so this way, I would say that the ethical question that I raised is also a question that can be applied to technologies, because ecology must be seen as part of human technology as well.
Yeah, and the fact that the oikos and the techne actually go hand in hand. Like economics is the techne of managing the house, so to speak. And there is like this particular play in it. We do have some interesting conversations from the Telegram chat. And the first question is for Paolo. And this is a very recursive meta question that comes from Lulu. So I'm going to read it very slowly. Lulu says, I thought the aspect of the idea of social media as a commenting platform is interesting. Do you see it as a form of protest, which can be seen as a form of refusal to get into a real protest, which would mean, again, to play by the rules people want to refuse?
Wow.
I know, but it's essentially saying that is this performance of refusal a way of not refusing in the traditional forms that were available to us, for example?
Or I'll try to address the first part of the question, because the second one is very philosophical. I don't know if I'm adequate to answer that. I think it is an expression of refusal, or a performance of refusal. I mean, just think about the fact that the most topical moments in online conversations and many trending topics are actually flames, right? They are very rarely celebratory moments or moments of unanimity, moments of harmony. They tend to be much more moments of conflict, moments of very heavy confrontation. In a way that is not completely new. Politics has always been about conflict. For a period, we had this illusion that politics was about people sitting around the room and just whatever, coming to an agreement, the famous idealized communicative situation of Habermas, while there was not really the prevalent modality of politics. And is interesting, for example, examples like pylons, right? Or people rushing public figures. I mean, think about, in the case of the US, figures such as Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. Every time they tweet, they get ratioed, which means that the number of quote tweets is much greater than the number of tweets, because quote tweets, not by technological definition, but by popular use, have been turned more into a way in which you cite people you don't like, right? That's the most, and comments also a very high number of comments, for example, compared to tweets. The kind of mathematical ratio between the two usually communicates that the conversation is not going where the poster wanted it to go. The comment section is not going as expected. I think that there's also a kind of satirical Facebook page on that. And I think that is quite interesting. It speaks to this idea of counter-democracy of Rosan Vallon, that in a situation in which many people are not affiliated or integrated to something that is more affirmative, in a way, the only form of participation that is left is more this signaling non-compliance and signaling refusal, which, again, I don't think that it is any rational form of politics as such, but obviously, if it is the only form of politics, risk being a bit nihilistic and self-feeding.
Thank you. But I think there is also something else at play in Lulu's question, perhaps, which is about the spectacle of these refusals, right? And at least I know within the social justice movements, they have been quite present as social signifiers, which are just hashtags, which refuse to take a side. It just exists as if in a limbo for anybody to kind of occupy it and squat it whenever they want to. But you can also evacuate it very easily so that you kind of do like this hashtag hopping, right? Where you could, in fact, use 3 contradictory hashtags all at the same time within the same message. So I thought there was also some element of spectacle and play there, which might be a different kind of an agency.
Yes, I think it also comes to the question in a way of how consequential these practices and these participation acts are. There's been some recent research kind of proving that there is actually a trade-off between online participation and offline participation. But at the same time, it's a form of participation that is not just performative in a negative sense, but that actually politicians are worried about. For example, in the UK, they're discussing this UK online safety bill, which would criminalize pylons as a form of harassment. And obviously there's a lot of hateful harassment going on online, but the risk is that through these regulations, they would basically criminalize this mass dissent that emerges online, which is something that politicians, for example, are not very much used to, right? It's something that they cannot control. They cannot control refusal, and hence they don't like it.
Yeah, thank you. Xenia, there is one more question for you, but I think, Imani, you might also want to perhaps address this. This comes from Federica Buongiorno. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Federica is asking, what's your opinion on the concept of environmental generational amnesia, among others by the likes of Peter Kahn? The idea that we construct a conception of what is environmentally acceptable and normal based on the natural world we experienced in our childhood, so that each generation takes the degraded condition as normal, even if the degradation itself increases. Right? Like there is a certain baseline which keeps on moving of how bad things can get. And every generation begins on that baseline as the normal. And then Federica ends by asking, would this be a way to then reintroduce a psychological or almost a psychoanalytic idea of nature as the original scene within the environmental discourse? It's a long question. Maybe both of you can pick up different aspects of it just to talk about it. Imani, do you want to go first? And then I will ask Xenia to join in there.
Sure. I wanted to, I'll touch upon this. And I think there's also something interesting in ways that it intersects with the prior question about the spectacle. But I think first, in terms of accepting ecological, I think it's a very fascinating question. Certainly my presentation started with asking, how much we're aware of ecological degradation. What does it mean for urban citizens to actually have a sense of the wider ecology in which they are actually situated, right? How much, how it's quite difficult really for folk to have a sense of how toxified and polluted their air is, their environment is, right? When so much of toxification is actually invisible to the naked eye, right? And so it's not just the sense that people are coming to accept a degraded ecology as normal, but it's really that we're not quite we're disconnected from an ability to sense it. Now, that being said, I want to spend some time speaking about folks in Louisiana who live in Cancer Alley and in what we call fence line communities. So the people who live closest to petrochemical plants and refineries, quite literally in the looming shadows of these plants. And folks who have become activists for the first time in their lives in the last few years have done so in response to their body's sensors, essentially going haywire and saying something is wrong, something is broken. They're feeling all sorts of different health effects, emphysema, asthma, skin quite literally peeling off of their faces when it rains. And these are signals, of course, from the ecology that is in a state of imbalance. Now, it doesn't mean, first of all, not every single person has the same types of environmental sensitivities. And so not everyone is going to experience ecological degradation in the same way. And just because people do experience these sort of health effects, it doesn't mean that they are, as mentioned earlier, going to make the connection to the fossil fuel industry. Or even if they do, that'll be enough to sort of dispel the myths that the fossil fuel industry is the generator of modernity, of progress, of freedom and democracy, right? And so a lot of people, accept the degraded ecology, not just because they think it's normal, but because they believe that it's a sacrifice, right, that has been made. And I think part of this is this kind of separation, what Xenia was sort of talking about between our sense of self and our sense of place, our sense of our wider ecology, that this ecology, is actually an extension of our body, or rather that our body is a node within an ecology, and that we are interconnected, and that violence against our ecology is actually violence against ourselves, right? And so there are, all of these practices of, reconnecting with our wider ecological body, that I think people who are in these extremely precarious positions in these fence-line communities, people who are otherwise marginalized, who we would say are lacking certain degrees of privilege, are actually in the best position, right, to start to reforge these relations, right? So I wanted to say that I think, just as refusal is not binary, privilege is also not binary. And this notion that refusal is, just to say it's not necessarily a nihilistic act. It's often an affirmation of life itself. And the last thing I wanted to say regarding, the spectacle is certainly I think, the spectacle of hashtag parades is something where we can kind of question what its force is in the world. But I think it's a really interesting thing to bring up, because the tradition of spectacle, again, I'm from New Orleans, so we actually have a very entrenched, which is why the Fossil Free Fest was organized as a festival. We have a very entrenched culture of spectacle, right? And Carnival, Mardi Gras, the pagan tradition, or the Catholic traditions, the West African, the Caribbean traditions that are all a part of this kind of legacy, are all cultures of refusal. Traditionally, Carnival is a political parade that is saying, basically F you to the political elite, the political establishment. Even in its, European sort of middle-age phases, Barbara Ehrenreich talks about Carnival as being a way of refusing, in a lot of ways, the kind of like staid hegemony of the Catholic Church, the authority of the Catholic Church. So there is an inherent connection between the spectacle, which is about bringing messages through creativity, creative generation into the streets, right? And the decision to say, I refuse the world as it is, and we're going to reimagine it together collectively.
Thank you. That is a very comprehensive input into the conversation. But Xenia, I know you also want to jump in to talk about, I'm fascinated with this idea of micro privileges and negotiations that have to happen, and what kind of a world is it building up. Please go ahead.
I'll try to put everything together. And I very much agreed with what Imani said. So my point here is to say we need to reinvent. I would use the word institutions, because I think in a very Deleuzian way we need to build that, to invent collectively new institutions. But in relation to ecology and our consciousness or unconsciousness about that, I would very briefly say that a feminist approach will probably change it a lot, but not the perspective for which especially men are using the word mother in relation to nature, which I find it very absurd, and I would radically go against it. But a feminist approach for which, and I'll do an example because I think specific cases can really show how much things are interconnected more than like theoretical level only. And the example is drawn from a good friend of mine who recently was diagnosed endometriosis. Before that, she wouldn't even know how to name that pain, right? She had that pain already, but she didn't know. Only now she's understanding that the specific pain, the very source of endometriosis is the environment. And the result of that is inside her own body. The way she individually, for now, managed to understand these very badly interconnections between her specifically and the world that we live in was due to this, right? To feeling this. But on another level, at the collective level, because I guess that refusal is basically only or mainly a collective attitude that we have. I've been studying social movement for forever. I mean, I'm a researcher, and I'm a researcher about law and social movements. And this specific movement called No TAF, which in Italy but also in Western Europe is kind of famous, is this environmental struggle against the high-speed railway project that should connect France and Italy. Well, all those activists, they became protesters and radical activists now due only to the fact that they realized that their environment where they live in was about to be destroyed. And it was already polluted, but they just realized that when it was the third or the fourth infrastructures they were about to build on in that area. Right? But it became not only a refusal, but an affirmative kind of politics, because they started to say, we don't say just no to this, we say no to the entire idea of what an environment should be constructed. And so they started to say yes to new inventions and political engagements.
Thank you. We do. Oh, sorry, Imani. Did you have to? Do you want to
Sorry,
jump in?
I just want to make one small point, which I just want to suggest that refusal is certainly, obviously, it's a collective process, but I do think that it is also an individual process. I think it's both entangled and entwined. And I think this example of coming into recognition of ecological violence through one's body is exactly the exemplar of that movement, from individual recognition, refusal, to accept, right, what's happening with one's body as normal, right, or as okay, and then deciding to take action, right, and then this mode of refusal is something that can spread and deepen and actually become generative through collective action. But I do want to just sort of push back on the notion that there is something nihilistic or alienating, or perhaps naive, right, about the individual kind of decision to sacrifice and to be intentional, and to reframe their life.
No, I thank you for bringing that up. Bassem, I'm wondering if these are also considerations that are coming up in your work right now, this dichotomy between the individual and the collective. Because in many ways, the examples that all of you are giving is about either an individual or a community recognizing the imminent and present danger and then responding to it because they see things collapse. But that kind of a political movement necessarily waits for the disaster to happen in order for action as a response. And I often thought that the poetics of refusal are so interesting because as feminist affect theorist Laurent Berlant, for example, had once mentioned, if you refuse or reject, not to exclude, but to show processes of care towards the other, that's a different kind of a refusal. It's a refusal which is oriented towards what David Theo Goldberg calls the politics of dread, but it goes into a completely different direction, and perhaps it is the politics of care. I'm just looking at the time and saying, do you want to have one last word on it, and then we can wrap this conversation up?
Yes, I think I will just divide my answer into two parts. I think kind of broad. I think going back to the case of Lebanon, it's sort of the same. Like at some point I was doing a lot, after the waste crisis, I was doing a lot of work on kind of the care work provided by the kafala system, and it is quite notable that that work, that the main avenue for migrant labor is in the field of care work. And I think there is ample reason for that. In Lebanon, like as discussed, like there are very high cancer rates. And a lot of times what ends up happening is that migrant workers end up providing private support for elderly individuals, for individuals who are suffering cancer. So kind of the ecological destruction, and I talked before about the electricity and energy sectors and the waste management, the private generators end up polluting so much more than the state-run facilities, even if the state-run facilities are lacking. And so like the care work and ecology are really like difficult to separate in that context. And I think on another level, in terms of thinking of the collective and the individual, I agree that it also becomes really easy to dismiss individual action. But I think, and this really comes up, I think, at the level of culture. Like when we think of cultural practitioners or artists or thinkers, we always want to aim for more collective work. But I think there is something to be salvaged from like individual interventions, from more symbolic or like interventions that happen at the level of spectacle or performativity. And I think in the end, yes, like it isn't. It's very easy to fall into an overcorrection and kind of emphasize the collective, whereas sometimes there is even some kind of, like a tyranny of that can also be present. But,
Thank you. It is right on the dot that we have to stop, but the conversations don't need to. I hope that within the Telegram group or within other spaces, we will continue some of these conversations forward. The one thing that I'm taking away perhaps is to say intentionality is what Imani started us with, and maybe we need to bring it back. And saying when we talk about refusal, we might need to talk about the intention of that refusal. And I'm taking away one very simple thing, that there is a refusal which rehearses the politics of gloom, doom, and despair. But maybe there is also a refusal which can rehearse the possibilities of hope and care. And maybe that intentionality is something that we need to bring into conversation. With that, I want to call this panel to a close. Thank you very much for all your extremely eloquent and passionate interventions, for the people who bore with us in this distributed format, for the people who gave us the questions. And I will just wrap it up by also letting you know that coming up next is a wonderful talk by Basham El Baroni. He's a dear friend who I was really hoping to meet, but he's not going to be here in person. Bassem is an inspirational philosopher. He works as a professor in curating and mediating art at the Aalto University. I've seen him talk, I've seen him speak, and for those of us who are staying back, it's going to be a treat to listen to him as he talks about emergent forms of activism that he calls leveraging practices and tactical propositions that carve out new equitable economic spaces. And for those of you who are still binge watching, so this is like the transmediale and chill version of things. After that, there is a silent film by the transmediale Willem Flusser residents of 2021 called Melt, which is going to explore the material transformations and failures of 3D technologies to capture shape-shifting matters. So we're going to say goodbye, but we are still going to continue streaming in different forms. Thank you very much, and have a good morning, afternoon, evening, night, whichever time you are in. Thank you.